Hello, my name is Cat Tobin. Well, strictly speaking, it's Katrina Tobin, but I tend to go by Cat. And I'm here at Ropecon 2021 to talk about me, the woman as I am, my career, and the games that I've loved along the way. So I'm going to be doing this live, and I tend to catch up with my fellow Pelgranistas every Friday, and we have kind of a chat like this. And I've become famous for my show and tell. So I'm going to be doing this presentation in a show and tell style. To start off with, who am I? Where did I come from? So as I mentioned, my name is Katrina Tobin, and I was born in a very tiny town in West Cork in Ireland, just about, about here. And I had, pretty standard Irish Catholic upbringing. I knew nothing at all about anything. And I had never heard of, the only games I'd heard of were the conventional ones like Monopoly. And, the only thing I knew about anything resembling hobby gaming was there was a miniatures factory actually about 40 miles away from my house. But I didn't know what they did. I just called it toy soldiers. So I knew nothing about the wider world of gaming. I loved board games, such as I had access to, but I knew nothing about the wider world of gaming until in 1995, I went to University College Cork. And it was there that I first encountered gaming. And my initial encounter with gaming was not very auspicious. So I went along to the college's society's fair, and there I signed up for the dramatic society and some other things that I was kind of interested in. And I came back to where I was staying, and I was staying in a shared house with a lot of other students. And one of the other students had picked up a flyer for a society called Larps, which was the Wargaming and Role-Playing Society. Now that meant nothing to me, but the flyer was for a game called Killer. And the idea was that you were given somebody's contact details, another student, and you would have to go out and kill them, try and assassinate them somehow. And meanwhile, somebody had your contact details and would be at the same time coming along to try and assassinate you. And this was kind of really, really thrilling sounding to me. I was like, I have never heard of anything like this. How cool. And I was like, I really want to see what that's about. So myself and my housemate went along to the Warps Freshers Night, their introductory event. And we turned up, and there was a kind of a greeter person at the door, and she was very friendly and lovely. And we chatted to her for a bit. We said, we don't know what we're doing, so tell us what to do. We're freshers, we're new to college and the world. And she directed us towards the back of the room where a man in medieval clothing was giving a talk. So we knew nothing more about that. We went down, we sat down in front of this man, and he explained about the medieval and Renaissance eras and how his organization, the SCA, Society for Creative Anachronism, liked to engage in those and to kind of teach people what it was like to live in those times. And we listened to his presentation, and I thought it was really interesting. It was like, I did not know that was a thing that people did. And my housemate had that expression I've become very familiar with over the years, that kind of, what is this? I don't know, I don't like it thing. So as we were leaving, I kind of said, well, I thought that was really interesting. And, I'm not sure whether I want to be like a medieval and Renaissance-y person, but I'm interested in kind of learning more about that as a thing people do. And she was terrified. She was like, no, I'm out. I'm out. If you go back, you're going back on your own. And I said, okay, fine. So the next Warps Freshers Night was 2 days later, and I went along by myself. And the same greeter was at the door. And when she saw me, she said, oh, the SCA aren't here tonight. And I kind of said, well, okay. And I kind of looked around the room, and there were a lot of people sitting at tables in groups, kind of talking to each other. And I said, well, like, what are all of these people doing? And she said, oh, they're playing games. I was like, well, I'd be interested in playing a game. I'd be up for that. And she's like, okay. And she said, well, why don't you have a seat over here with this person? And I was like, okay. So I sat down at the table, and it was a Star Trek game. I was a big Star Trek fan, and which had been, you know, quite a massive sci-fi fan then and now. And I sat at this table, and the GM was very, very scared. He was a very shy guy. He was mumbling, kind of, he was hiding behind his GM screen. The other players at the table were all freshers. They had kind of turned up to try this thing out, didn't know what they were doing. Most of them were quite disengaged, and the GM didn't really have the skills to re-engage them. So it was a terrible, terrible game, my first ever RPG, but I just sat there and I thought, okay, so this guy is not great and these people don't care. But if you had a GM who knew what they were doing, and if you had players that were engaged in telling this collaborative story, this could be the greatest experience in the world. And, you know, it's funny, that was nearly 25 years ago now, more than 25 years ago now. Oh God, I don't even want to think about that. But anyway, it was that long ago, and I have never really lost that feeling about RPGs, about role-playing as a hobby. From the very first time I sat down at a table with other players, it felt like coming home to me. You know, it felt like finding my tribe, like finding my people, understanding suddenly where I was supposed to be in the world. Now, obviously enough, that's not quite how life goes, and I'll talk a little bit later on about how I ended up diverging from that path. But for the time being, I'm in UCC, University College Cork, and I'm involved with the Wargaming and Role-Playing Society, Warps. And my first role in Warps was as the public relations officer, the PRO. And this was back in the days before the internet. There were such times. And as a PRO, I would have to kind of stick pieces of paper onto other pieces of paper and stick images on to make posters that I could then hang around the university. And this was one for Ganglands, which was kind of the group version of the Assassin's Killer game that I had originally joined for. And the reason that I'm kind of, oh yeah, I should also show you this one. Fun thing with beer was a kind of a recurring theme of Warps events. But the reason that I'm showing you that and kind of talking about being a public relations officer is that it's really interesting to me now, looking back on that kind of time in my life when I was in college. I studied English and philosophy. I got a degree in that. But really, the parts of my college experience that most prepared me for what I'm doing now, both in terms of as a career and as a kind of a human being, as an adult, I learned being on the committee in Warps, in the Wargaming and Role-Playing Society. I learned so much about advertising, marketing, publicity, organizing, dealing with authorities and bureaucracies, you know, getting people together, leading people, and just making things happen, as well as a lot about desktop publishing, which would turn out again was quite useful in my later life. So Warps is really very, very formative for me in many ways. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this show and tell thing. It was there that I met one of my closest friends, who's now the internationally renowned novelist Gareth Ryder Hanrahan, but at the time when I knew him was just Gareth. And he was then and continues to be one of my closest friends, and also now a colleague of mine at Pelgrane Press. But again, I'll come on to that later. So one of the biggest things that I was involved with, while the most defining things that I was involved with in Warps was the society's convention, which was called Ropecon. There we go, Ropecon. So we actually, in 2006, ended up winning the Diana Jones Award, which is an international award that's kind of given to things that represent excellence in gaming for our convention charity auctions. This year is me and Michael Sheard, over here probably, who played Admiral Ozziel in Star Wars. This is me cutting off my then boyfriend's ponytail in the name of charity. And for that act and many other such enterprising acts of charity, both WorkCon and GaelCon, which is the biggest convention in Dublin, were named as kind of representative of Irish convention charity auctions, which, like I said, won the Diana Jones Award. So, you know, we were quite chuffed with that. Other things we won, I personally got a what's called a Bene Merenti Award from the university. This is it. Shiny. Ooh. I broke the back of it. And I got that for the work that I did with Warps and with WorkCon. Again, so kind of learning to understand more about how the world functioned, how bureaucracies functioned, and also how you worked within a bureaucracy and got things done within it. We also, following on from that, one is going to be very blurry because all photos were blurry back in those days. It's just how photos were. This is myself and my co-convention director, Donald Catalan, receiving the award for the national best event run by any university society in the country for WorkCon in 1999. And just to give you kind of a sense of what WorkCon meant, I've just got a little picture here of the bar. Again, I think this is probably something that's anyone who's been to an Irish convention will know that the social aspect and the bar are a really big part of who we in Ireland are as a nation of gamers and a nation of people. But we really do in Ireland have a strong sense of gaming community, or rather we did at the time. There was a lot of links between Warps in Cork and WorkCon and the other gaming groups in societies and universities around the country. So we all communicated, we all traveled around to go to each other's conventions. And as a result, Ireland in the kind of late 1990s, kind of early 2000s, had probably one of the largest convention scenes in, you know, certainly in terms of its size as a country, it proportionally, it would have had one of the biggest convention scenes probably in the world. Like every university society effectively had their own convention. There was something like 14 conventions running in Ireland at kind of the height of convention mania. And yeah, we all supported each other. We all knew each other. We all went to each other's conventions. We all ran games for each other. And our Irish convention way of running games is also quite different to how it's done, I think, in the UK and in other countries. So for us at Irish conventions, we write game adventures to be run by other GMs. So our kind of system, our way of organizing our conventions trains us towards RPG adventure writing. And I think that that's a lot of the reason why my friend Gareth Hanrahan is such an exceptional adventure writer. He's honed that skill over many, many years of literally having to write a document that was very, very often handed to somebody 5 minutes before a game was due to start and told, run this. So he's really kind of honed the ability to translate how a game runs onto paper, which is a really important skill for an RPG writer. So I dabbled myself in RPG adventure writing. One of the main things, the first thing I ever wrote was a convention adventure for macho women with guns. It was there. And I then moved on to writing things like GURPS Horror and kind of Unknown Armies and more games in that kind of horror connected, in that kind of genre and with that kind of feel. Unknown Armies had come out kind of in the late 90s, and that was a real, I think myself and Gareth both really grasped onto that as a game that really spoke to us in terms of what it was trying to do. And it's interesting again because there's a strong investigative aspect to it. It's a modern day game, and it's horror, but it's not jump scare horror. It's more of a kind of a building creepiness and uncertainty about the world. And I played other games as well. I mean, obviously I was of an age to get caught up in the vampire mania, and I also really, really loved the Cthulhu game. I got into LARPing through Vampire, as many people of my generation did, and it was my first experience of it, and I really enjoyed it. I absolutely loved LARPing. It seemed like a purer form of tabletop role playing. I've really evolved my thinking on that since, in that I now see how important it is to have both live action and tabletop, because there are so many things you can do in tabletop role playing that you just cannot do in a LARP, narratively and in terms of kind of the way you can structure plots. But with a LARP, there's an immediacy that I find really appealing to it. It's right there. You're getting the full gaming experience straight up. So yeah, I really, really loved LARPs. Started writing then more LARPs than tabletop adventures for conventions still. And I'm still in Ireland. I'm still in college and kind of just leaving college, just graduating. And what we tend to mean when we talk about LARP in Ireland, and when we talk about the kind of LARPs in particular that we were running at our conventions in Ireland in the late 90s, what we are talking about is what's now called Freeforms. So they tend to be quite, so if you watched Ian Thomas and Rachel Thomas's talk earlier, Ian talked about them being quite linear, and that's certainly true for Freeforms. They're very heavily plotted. It was, usually they took a format quite similar to murder mysteries, in that there was a problem to be solved. Maybe you had to collect up all the pieces of an artifact and put it together to save the world, or you had to make a big decision about whether you as a group would do this thing or take this action. So they were quite very, very structured in terms of their plotting and their narrative. They were and still are, they're very kind of lighthearted. They're not necessarily thematically deep or dark. They're more kind of games as enjoyment. games as kind of the equivalent of a book you would read on the beach. They're designed to be played and enjoyed, and just there's nothing more to it. They're not trying to prompt you to think about anything. You kind of walk away and that's the game over. There's no, you don't workshop characters. There is absolutely no out of game conversation allowed about the game. So you can't pre-plan things. You can't talk about things out of character. You're really discouraged from doing that. And they're quite they can be quite GM intensive in that the GMs know the shape or the structure of the game, and there are things that have to happen during the game. There are like timed or triggered events that have to happen and that prompt other things to happen in the story. So players are not encouraged to bring in a lot of their own storyline or their own information, because it can throw out the overall plot and structure of the game. So I really, really enjoyed those freeforms. But the thing is, I could only play them really at conventions. I only had access to Larps at conventions. Vampire had kind of died down a bit, after its initial popularity, it had kind of faded away a bit in favor of other Camarilla games that I wasn't as keen on, or other White Wolf World of Darkness games rather. So I was only LARPing at conventions, so a couple of times a year, and not in a significant way. So in 2002, after graduating from college with no idea at all what I wanted to do in the world or with my life, I went to Japan for a couple of months, which was cool. And while I was there, I met a woman who had studied in Edinburgh. And she said to me, in Japan, I think you'd really like Edinburgh. And I said, okay then. And I booked a flight to Edinburgh with a backpack one way. And that was it. And yeah, so it's Edinburgh Castle. And this is a good friend in a very Scottish, it's my Scottishest photo, I think. Yeah, so in 2002, I moved to Edinburgh, not knowing how it was going to be, how long I would be there, or what it meant in any sort of way. I was still quite connected into the Irish RPG scene. I had co-founded a convention called K2, which was a fully residential convention, and I'm still kind of running that from Edinburgh. And again, going back to the kind of the Irish, it's just kind of in our nature to meet people and welcome people, the Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes kind of thing of the Irish. So I naturally brought Scottish people back over to Irish conventions and brought Irish people over to Scottish conventions. So we started having a really great kind of a back and forth then through that. So while I was in Edinburgh, one of the first things that happened was I got involved in a fantastic Buffy Vampire Slayer role-playing campaign. And that really changed how I saw RPGs, because for the very first time, we started talking about the plot of the game. We started pre-planning. Basically, we would meet up between sessions and we would talk about the kind of play that we would have in the next session, what our characters would do, how they would go about their lives, and how that would flow through and play through. And it wasn't something I'd encountered before, but it made it so much more satisfying to be able to have that kind of agency over my characters' actions. And that was something that I really kind of internalized and again brought with me into kind of later thinking about games. While I was in Edinburgh, I also got I met up with some of the Contested Grounds gang. So they produced a wonderful game called A State, which is currently being kickstarted. If you're interested, they're kickstarting a second edition with using the Forged in the Dark rules. So I'm actually credited in this supplement. faces in the crowd, as the accountant for Contested Grounds. Now, that's being very generous. I don't know that I actually ever did real proper accounting for it. But what I did do with Contested Grounds was really learn for the first time how a small games company ran. I was there for the meetings of the kind of the main creatives and organizers of Contested Grounds. I would be at their meetings. I would kind of hear how they planned convention attendance, how they planned buying in stock, how they planned managing that stock, making creative decisions, how they expanded out their product line, everything that a small business, everything that a small RPG business encounters, I guess, I came across for the first time through my volunteer work with Contested Grounds. So that really kind of whetted my appetite, I think, for more games related work. And also while I was there, I'm pretty sure that you had Gregor Hutton as a guest at Ropecon a few years ago, but Gregor is just, I adore him, he's one of my closest friends, but it was through him that I discovered what I would call kind of indie or story games. And that, again, had a massive impact on my thinking about games, because at the time there was a big international movement called the Forge, and there was a lot of really, really interesting RPG design coming out of design, and also thinking about RPGs, thinking about game design, discussing game design, analyzing games, critiquing games, and just talking about RPGs in a way that maybe there hadn't been that kind of discussion and conversation before. And I found that really interesting. And I was really excited about games like Gregor's Best Friends, about games that were they were like nothing I'd ever seen or played before. They were lighter, they were kind of lighter hearted. They were really interesting story-wise. They often covered like non-standard topics, so they weren't fantasy, they weren't sci-fi, they were about groups of catty girlfriends or whatever. So that again was the thing that I really kind of grabbed onto and went, this is an area that I'm very, very interested in and I want to see more of and do more with. So I've just noticed there that there's a question in chat. Somebody's asked how many participants the Irish conventions in the 90s and 2000s had on average. So at the time, GaelCon and WorkCon had about 500 each. They were kind of the two, Goliaths or whatever. There was also a convention in Belfast called QCon that started off, I think, with about 200 or 300, but they ended up kind of, becoming a lot more of an anime convention. So I think they're probably the biggest convention in the country now. So even though they were a bit smaller at the time, they've now grown into the thousands of people. And then the longest running convention in the country is called Leprecon, obviously, and that's in Trinity College, Dublin, and they'd have about 100 to 200 people. And then kind of there were other conventions around the country. Itzicon was a new convention that started up in Galway, and they get about 100 people, kind of 50 to 100 people, depending on the kind of the newness of the convention, how well the people organizing the convention were kind of known, and how many other people they could kind of drag in, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I'm in Edinburgh. I have encountered story games, indie games. I really like them. I've encountered small press RPGs, and I really like that. But I am professionally an accountant at that point. So I'm working in financial services, and I'm a systems accountant. So I'm looking at the most boring parts of systems, the bits that run the accounting. And I hate it. I hate it so much. I really hate it. And I try applying for other jobs, and every time I apply for another job, somebody says to me, well, you seem like you might be okay, but look, whatever this games thing is you do, whenever you talk about that, your eyes light up. It's clear that's your passion. I'm like, yeah, I know, but there's no jobs in it. So in 2011, my father had a heart attack, and I was living in Edinburgh. I hated my job. I didn't own property. I wasn't with anyone, and it really made me look at my life and kind of go, what am I doing here? Like, really, what am I doing here right now? And I didn't have a good answer for that. So I thought, okay, well, right, I'll just, I should probably do something else then. So I moved back to Ireland, and I moved back to Cork City originally, which is the closest city to where I'm from. And I started studying. I co-founded a games company with another friend, and the plan was to run kind of alternate reality games. So I was really interested in kind of street games, so pervasive games, the kind of games that took up space in the world. Really quite interested in those at the time, and I set up a company, but I actually started studying Java programming for Android, because I was like, well, I'll make mobile games and that will be how I'll make my money, and that will fund the kind of the more interesting and kind of innovative games that I'll be doing through my other games company. And then in 2012, while I was living in Cork, I got involved with running a convention in London called Dragon Meet. And this is a convention I'd been attending as a punter for like 10 years. And I helped out with Cubicle 7, who at the time owned it and were running it. And while I was there, I met Simon Rogers from Pelgrane Press. And I was kind of running off my feet, and he had an issue. So he came in and was annoying, and I was snappy. But I must have looked like I knew what I was doing, because he said, I'm interested in running a Pelgrane convention. And I said, well, I run conventions, so, let me, hit me up sometime for my CV or whatever. And we left it at that. A couple of months later, he emailed me and he said, hey, remember you said you'd send me your CV. Can you forward it on? And I said, sure. So I sent him like a targeted, focused event organizing CV. At that point, I'd been involved in conventions in Cork, in Dublin, in my own one that I co-founded in Edinburgh. I've been involved with a lot of different conventions in the UK and Ireland. So I listed all of those on my CV. It was all just, focused on the events. And he replied saying, do you have any other skills? And I was like, well, probably, but like, can you narrow it down a bit there? What are you looking for? And then he replied with a job description. And it turned out that my predecessor, Beth, was leaving, and he was looking for somebody to replace her. So I spent days writing up a CV, writing up a cover letter, applied for the role along with hundreds of other people. He said to me, would you be willing to move to London if you got the job? Because obviously this isn't something that you've done professionally before. And I said, yes, I would. For this, I would. This is my dream. This is literally my dream job. And he said, okay. And I got the job. And in 2013, I moved to, actually, this should be in Birmingham right now, but it's not. It's here with me. And so I moved to Pelgrane Press. So I joined Pelgrane Press in 2013 as a publishing, publishing editor. And that was there was a steep learning curve, as I knew there would be. In my first year, I published 12 books. The very first one of which still holds a massive place in my heart, is Alehoop Trail. And it's just a really cute little D20 fantasy game. Another one of which was previously kickstarted, and it's Hillfolk, which is just a fantastic game of interpersonal, inter-character drama. So the way we kind of tend to describe it is as, if you imagine a HBO show, this is like the way of role-playing a HBO show. And it's really like, Hillfolk has really kind of changed the way I think about how you build character relationships in all RPGs. I now do it completely differently, whatever I'm playing. I tend to connect up characters more in advance. I tend to pre-plan what their relationships are going to be like, how they map out with each other, and how those are likely to play out as well over the course of the game, which is something that Hillfolk gives you a lot of tools for. Then, in November 2014, Simon was really busy with his other company. He also co-owns a company called Pro Fantasy Software with his other business partner. He was really busy with that, and we had to run a Kickstarter. So I ended up basically running the Kickstarter. And that was for the now infamous Dracula dossier. This was actually illustrated by a Finnish artist, now that I can think about it. Yeah, anyone who's heard me talk about that knows that it was simultaneously a really high point for me in my career, and also a really low point. We're really proud of what the game is. So essentially, Dracula Unredacted is a copy of the novel of Dracula with about 20% extra material that was previously redacted by MI6 added back into it. We've also unredacted 2 characters that were in the original book, but had been redacted out to make it into a novel, so that nobody would realize that it was actually an after report of events that really happened when MI6 tried to recruit Dracula as a spy. So Dracula Unredacted is then annotated by 3 different generations of MI6 analysts. And this is effectively a giant player handout. All of this is it's a handout. And so you look up anything, any person, any place, any item that's referenced in Dracula, and you don't need like unredacted, you can just use a normal copy of Dracula. And then you look it up in the director's handbook, which has all of the maps, all of the people, all of the places, all of the items, and kind of ways of like structuring a massive sandbox campaign spanning, a century and a half of 2 centuries of Dracula basically being recruited at various times to fight various foreign enemies by MI6 and a subset within them called Edom. So it's a phenomenal campaign. It ended up running into like a 5 or 6 book series. But we decided as part of that we would do a folder of handouts called the Hawkins Papers. And that was amazing, but we individually tea stained and burned and aged about 40 documents and 10 individual index cards for each folder, and we had to do 500 of them. So Simon and I had a lot of debates about that, and it was very important to me that we delivered what we had promised our Kickstarter backers that we would. And he was more realistic, understanding, as he did better than I did, the amount of work that was involved in that. So the upshot of it was that we ended up actually not delivering the Dracula dossier. It funded in November 2004, and we didn't actually ship it finally until March 2017, because I spent literally most of a year just burning things and throwing ink on them and tearing them and stapling them and sellotaping them. And yeah, it was a lot. And it really kind of taught me a lot about running Kickstarters and, and just scale and scope of things as well. And, it's the product we produced in the end was amazing, but it was too much for us as a company of our size. Way too much, really. So it was important not to do that again. I think was my takeaway from that. But kind of in the intervening period, there had been a nano games anthology called #Feminism published, and I was one of the people who wrote a nano game for this anthology. I just thought it was such a fantastic idea, and it became really a kind of it was interesting to me how much of a symbol it became, I suppose. I think that was Indiegogo'd or like crowdfunded in December in 2015. And just a year earlier, Gamergate had happened, and the waves of that occurrence were still very much being felt, I think, by women across the games industry. So it couldn't have come at a more important time, I think. And it was such an important piece of work, and it really impressed me, both in terms of the stunning physical artifact of the book. It's just an incredible book. But also the games are so provocative in a good way. They provoke an emotional reaction. They provoke thought. They provoke engaging with feminist issues in a way that is really, it goes beyond education. When we talk about educational games, but role-playing is such a powerful force. It's such a powerful tool for learning and for changing how you think about the world and how you interact with the world. So largely inspired by what I had seen there, and also my work with Dragonmeat. We didn't have a massive budget for guests, so I had to find guests based in the UK. And I really wanted to have a diverse guest list, but I really struggled to find women guests who were based in the UK. So I decided to, because obviously a key thing is that you want to, when you're inviting a guest, it's important that you invite somebody who is valid in their own right. So I decided to go in search of the women RPG writers in the UK, and I found a group of 7 non-men. They're not all women, but they're all not men. And I produced this anthology called 7 Wonders, which is probably my kind of real, it was effectively a project that I did entirely by myself. I commissioned it from the writers. I wrote up the specs for the games. And then I kind of edited it all together and kind of, brought them into a kind of a consistency so that reading through the games, they read as a book. And it's just, as a project, I literally was involved in every single aspect of it. And I put a lot of myself and my thoughts and my ideas into it. And it won the Indie Game Designer Network, the Indie Games Awards for Best Game in 2016. So so I think it was worth it. But again, it's really a product of everything that I've kind of come out of so far in terms of how I think about games, like how I think about game design, I think about game development, how I think about like how I think about games, how I want to play games, the kind of games I want to play, and the kind of games I want to see more of in the world. And that's a really interesting thing to me about 7 Wonders and about #Feminism, is that they are so different. Like there are fantasy games in 7 Wonders, and there are, there's fantasy games, there's a sci-fi game, but there are also games about like little creatures that live around your house, which is a really cozy, wonderfully domestic game that was actually written by Lynn Hardy, I think you had as a guest at Ropecon last year. And also, a game about like the children from Narnia, like after they grew up, what must it be like to be an adult, to have lost access to that magical, wonderful world. And yeah, so it's kind of, it's that kind of experience. I'm going to briefly go off camera because my my next props are very far away. So it's that kind of experience, I think, that I'm really, that's what I'm looking for in my kind of games and in my life at the moment. And we've just recently published a game called The Yellow King RPG. And again, we kickstarted that, and there was various printing-related disasters involved, but it's out there. And it looks a lot at player agency, at kind of structuring a larger game, and at kind of at looking at bringing the players' desires into the game. So like reflecting parts of the players and the characters' interests and aspects in the game. So you have what's called a juiced peculiar thing. And that's kind of a thing that's odd about your character, or something your character's experienced that they can't quite express. And the game explicitly calls on the GM to like weave the narrative of that through their games. So it's very player focused, which a lot of our Pelgrane games are. They're super, super player focused. So yeah, another thing, obviously, just, being virtually in Finland, if not in real life, another massive influence on my thinking about games and my experience of games and what I want from games has been Nordic Lark. In, I want to say 2018, I went to play the fantastic Convention of Thorns LARP in Poland. And again, it's really interesting how much you can learn from playing one game. Like that one LARP just really changed so much about how I think about games. And I've kind of really looking at the things that have impacted me, I suppose, and made me the kind of woman I am today. But yeah, like the thing with Convention of Thorns, like I met a lot of Finnish players there, a lot of fantastic Finnish players there, and they were so phenomenally generous with me. And that's the only word I can think of to describe it. The way that they focused on other people, the way they played up other people's characters. I had never experienced people role playing that way with me before. It was like, I was, it really seemed like how it should be done. It was just fantastic. I was supposed to be playing this terrifying combat, Bruja combat machine, and I'm tiny and I'm, excitable, and I really, really struggled to play that. But the people around me were so fantastic at like just playing up my terror, that I really kind of realized that that's how you can create those, even though you have like a LARP structured in what you see is what you get kind of way, you can still use your imagination, or you can use your own role play to further the actual meta narrative, right? To further the game world, to change and impact the game world itself, not just kind of the plot or whatever, which I found that fascinating. And it really, it made me want more of that kind of experience. So, I briefly went off and was a wizard at Wizarding College, and was a posh Edwardian in Edwardian times, various castles in Poland. But none of them were as really kind of formative, I think, for me as Convention of Thorns, because I learned so much from the international, particularly from the Scandinavian players, like from the Nordic Larpers, just in terms of how you can be a better player. And we often talk about how we talk so much about how to be a better GM, how to run games, how to, do this and do that. But it was my first time kind of learning that you could be a better player, how to be a better player, how to give more to your fellow players, how to create space for them, how to hold that space for them, and how to give them spotlight, how to make them the star of their scene, and then like with a reciprocity, so that they would then make you the star of your own scene. And it's, we always talked about Larps being like a film that you were the protagonist of. But in Nordic Lark, like everyone is the protagonist and everyone is the star. And there's a really fascinating supportive community that exists I think in the Nordic Lark community, and it's really, really, again, it's something I would just love to bring more of into international tabletop play, because I think there are so many really useful lessons that we can learn as players of games, as well as of GMs of games, from that kind of play, from that generosity of spirit, from that uplifting other players, and just playing to lose, allowing your character to make mistakes, allowing your character to fail, so that you can further the story and get, more interesting emotional responses from the story. So yeah, so that's all, I guess, kind of where I currently am in 2021 with my games and with Pelgrane. I'm now the co-owner of Pelgrane. That happened along the way, so myself and Simon own it 50%. He's currently on sabbatical, so for the last 2 years I've been running Pelgrane by myself, and that's been interesting during the pandemic. But we're actually, as I speak, we're currently presently at UK Games Expo in Birmingham. So yeah, we're at our first physical convention since the start of the pandemic, and that's really, that's interesting to me to see how that goes. And it's, we've also been looking a lot at virtual tabletops, and we've been structuring our games to play on virtual tabletops, and that's obviously not going to go away now that people have realized that they can do it. I've heard so much about like gaming groups coming together and international players playing together over Zoom or over kind of virtual platforms. So it's definitely the future. That's kind of where things are going, but hopefully we can bring a lot of the lessons that we've learned from the past along with us. Yeah, so I noticed somebody has asked if it's possible to play First Joyful Mystery. So yeah, let me know. We'll get on the Discord about it. So yeah, I think that's probably me well over time with my various ramblings. But yeah, it's been lovely to chat through my very, very meandering journey through my career and my games, the games that have impacted me. Yeah, so if anyone has any more questions, any questions in the chat? Can't see any, so I guess I'll say goodbye, Ropecon. And hopefully we'll be able to see you in person next year. Fingers crossed.